Peter Meyer checked his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. Nothing visible through the rain streaking his windshield. But that didn't really mean much. He'd spent years traveling through Germany and Poland, armed with French fries and a camera, tracking objects that had been spotted by satellites. He knew the math of surveillance, the calculated distances, the way headlights would vanish just a fraction too deliberately. Now, he wasn't exactly James Bond. All that fast food and beer had the papers describing him as a bespectacled native of The Hague, with somewhat of a plump face and a slight paunch. The envelope inside his jacket pocket felt like it was burning through to his skin. Strange how a few ounces of paper could weigh so much. Meyer knew what his research proved, the truth about Black Tulip, Bouterse's threats against his boss's life, Major Kunder's report being buried. Now you had American JSOC troops secretly scoping out Paramaribo. Everything they tried to bury when they labeled him unstable, an alcoholic, and a security risk. One thing was clear. Dutch officials had helped to push their former colony toward a coup, and then they buried the evidence. The Hague could deny it as much as they wanted. Rain peppered his windshield as he guided his Volkswagen through the empty streets of Delft. He thought back to how this had all started. 8 months after Bouterse and his NCO comrades took over, in October of 1980, he'd received a call from Colonel Marsevane. He received instructions to report to the head of Army Staff Intelligence and Securities Department, where Marsevane told him he would need a right-hand man, because, and I'm quoting here, "I can't trust the Dutch military mission." April 1981, he arrived in Paramaribo, officially as an administrative assistant, a glorified secretary to the colonel. Suriname was the kind of place that they would send spies who'd gotten one too many DUIs standing on a bridge over the Oder while doing surveillance, and then earned a citation for resisting arrest just for good measure. It's a standard diplomatic posting, logistics coordination, the kind of jobs where you'd see classified documents as a part of routine work. Except for nothing about Suriname had been routine. The timing of Meyer's arrival in April of 1981 couldn't have been worse. Just 4 weeks earlier, on March 5th, 1981, Bouterse had stunned Western intelligence community. He released the imprisoned Marxist sergeants Badrasane Sital, Chaz Minjals, and Stanley Drummond. And he declared Suriname would follow the course of socialism. Sital would be promoted to the Minister of Public Health. Bouterse promised to march shoulder to shoulder with his brothers in arms and comrades in the vanguard of the revolutionary process. Long live socialism! Long live the revolutionary process! Long live the Surinamese revolution! Major Bouterse had been apparently converted. This is why Marsevane needed a right-hand man he could trust. This is why the Ministry of Defense approved sending over an experienced counterintelligence operative to what should have been a routine diplomatic posting. Meyer wasn't just arriving at ancient history. He was arriving at a precise moment when the original operation was collapsing and when the Dutch were scrambling to control or regain control of an asset that had gone rogue. Within weeks of Meyer's arrival, Bouterse would be secretly meeting with Fidel Castro, and by November he would establish the Revolutionary Front, the machinery that had prevented a leftist electoral victory in February 1980 was now desperately trying to prevent the moderate dictator that they had encouraged from becoming a communist threat that they had feared all along. For his part, Bouterse tried to downplay the threat. He was arguing that Western democracy had been tried and failed. A hybrid solution must be found. And this is a quote from him from that period of time. Naturally, we did not have a ready-made solution for all the problems. We also refused to work from blueprints. Some people are quick to point at countries like Cuba and Nicaragua, but Suriname must find its own path to socialism. We want to interpret socialism in our way and proceed with necessary caution. We prefer to take a balanced course, and we do not want to take drastic measures. You cannot judge the situation here by Western standards, the very model of parliamentary democracy that has failed miserably here. In the West, it also took hundreds of years for the system to develop into what it is today. In Suriname, we had a parliamentary democracy for 30 years, but experience has shown that this model is unsuitable in our country. It only led to cronyism and corruption. Parliament did not function. Only personal feuds were fought there. April 1st, 1981, the same day, Suriname's President Henk Chinesen called American Ambassador Crowley to express his dismay about the assassination attempt that had just happened on President Reagan's life. Marsevain himself received an anonymous call with a terrifying warning. Bouterse wanted him dead. If Marsevain did not stop investigating his predecessor, Colonel Hans Valk, Bouterse had promised the president he would be forcibly put on a plane or he would, quote, suffer an accident. Now, this wasn't the first death threat. Investigative reporter Rudy Kagi, who had investigated the murder of Fred Ormskirk, had been threatened himself by a lynching and been told by the regime that they only had to pay a junkie 25 guilders to run him off the road. Before Marsevain boarded his return flight, a friend of Bouterse slipped him a pistol because there was still a chance of an attack on a government-owned plane. Meyer would be their next target. They tried to paint his boss Marsevain as crazy, overstressed, as having a mental breakdown, but Myers knew this was all bullshit. His boss was a straight shooter, an incorruptible soldier, but the Faulkners, this clique of Dutch officers who had gone native and who were already plotting to sabotage them both. Right from the start, the Dutch military mission members had made it clear that Peter was not welcome. Marsevain's spy, they like to call him, which was not entirely wrong. He had done counterintelligence work in Warsaw and Bonn, and it had taught him how to document things, how to preserve evidence, how to build cases. Meyer claimed that he had found the smoking gun by accident in May of 1981. It was in a filing cabinet in the consulate, housed in a folder that should have been secured or transferred to The Hague years ago or destroyed. It was called Operation Black Tulip, a pre-independence Dutch military contingency plan from 1974-75 era. Officially, what it was an evacuation protocol, but according to Meyer's calculations, he saw a different kind of map. He saw annotations in a handwriting that he recognized as being Colonel Valk's, suggesting tactical analysis that went beyond just a rescue plan, including airports and key bridges and radio stations. To his eye, it was a defensive plan that had been reimagined into an offensive blueprint. As he was driving, a flash of lights appeared in his mirror again. They were definitely following him. Meyer pressed down slightly on the accelerator. Witnesses would later claim to have seen his car traveling at high rates of speed as it approached a gentle bend in the road. He'd spent months connecting the dots, recording conversations, drunken admissions from mission members, and documents that matched the plans Bouterse's men had used in the coup. And the pattern that he uncovered was worse than just a single conspiracy. It was an entire invisible machine. Before they forced him out in December of 1981, before the hit pieces happened in the press, before the alcoholic label was applied to him, Meyer had noticed something else. There was a rhythm to the communication. Personnel changes, a new pattern of coordination. Whatever it was that they had going on, it looked like operational preparation, not crisis response. The pieces were moving into place on the chessboard. Captain Clements moved from the mission into Bouterse's inner circle. Adjutant Verdier arrived and started training Bouterse's intelligence services. None of this was normal. And while we can only speculate on the exact details of what Peter Meyer had intended to reveal to reporters when he promised that, quote, heads would roll, one thing was for certain. His final investigation had moved beyond the Black Tulip phase of the 1980 coup. It was driven by a quest for transparency. He was now neck deep in a live, covert operation, the infiltration of Bouterse's security apparatus, the exfiltration of Surinamese insurrectionists mid-coup. There was intelligence extraction that was going on and weaponization against the resistance movement back in the Netherlands. What waited for him was a psychiatric evaluation at Schiphol Airport in December of 1981, when he returned to the Netherlands. Such a civilized way to disappear someone. There were doctors waiting in ambulances, all very professional, all very concerned about his mental state and his health. Only a quick call to his friend Eddie prevented them from helping him right into an institution. His brother Hans would later call it a crazy reception. 6 weeks after that, on February 2nd, 1982, the state's whole unstable, overstressed mental breakdown narrative hit a significant roadblock when Dr. C. Honing, who is a physician with the National Medical Service, conducted an independent evaluation and declared that the whistleblower, Peter Meyer, was perfectly healthy, both mentally and physically. This assessment, coming from a state-affiliated medical professional, directly challenged the overstrained breakdown label that they had applied to Peter, his superiors had applied. But by then it really didn't matter because Meyer wasn't in Paramaribo anymore investigating. He wasn't documenting ongoing operations, at least not officially. He was now a security risk, sidelined, his credibility questioned, his evidence tainted by the psychological weapon that had already done its work. Not long after, his phone started to click oddly during calls. Then came the signs of search in his apartment. Books were slightly misaligned, papers were disrupted. His apartment showed subtle signs of professional entry. His brother Hans would later confirm these weren't paranoid delusions. He said, "Peter's phone was tapped. He was regularly shadowed. I saw it myself," Hans would testify. And they tried more direct methods too to neutralize him. By now he could swear that pursuing car was getting closer. No more pretense of surveillance. The curve in Westlandweg zoomed ahead, a black mouth opening in the rain. Meyer took it faster than usual, feeling the Volkswagen's tires hunting for grip. For a moment, everything seemed suspended. The rain, the lights, the weight of the truth against his chest. Then the physics took over. The world tilted, and the tires lost their battle with the wet road. The streetlights became a whirling blur. A tree appeared suddenly, impossibly large, in his headlights. And in that final second, Meyer's hand instinctively moved toward the envelope. His last conscious thoughts were of the documents, his proof of the Dutch conspiracy and complicity, of how a young democracy had been guided into military rule. Someone had to know. Someone had to... The sound of crumpling metal split the night. When I was a kid growing up in Suriname in the mid-'80s, my mother used to tell me things about our neighborhood that just didn't quite add up. The man next door wasn't just a neighbor. He was a Desi Bouterse. He was running the country. And for years I thought that the story was mine alone, this weird, surreal childhood memory that I couldn't explain to anyone. Turns out it's also a CIA story, a Dutch intelligence story, and what we're about to show you today is a story about how men with power quietly turn other men into weapons, and they call it friendship the whole time. My name is Matthew Smith. This is the Suriname Contra Affair, and this episode is about the handlers. We all know what the spies look like in the movies, right? They're lean and athletic, and they drive fast, and they never sleep in the same bed twice. They don't trust anybody. They have a gun taped underneath a lid of a toilet somewhere in Prague, and you recognize them instantly because they look like someone who would ruin your day. But that's not actually how it works in real life. The most dangerous people in intelligence don't really look dangerous at all. In fact, they might look like a colonel who took a lonely soldier out who was in a foreign land to dinner because the kid was homesick. Or they might look like a sports instructor who just happened to be friends with all the right people 15 years later. They could look like a neighbor who cut a hole in the fence so that two men could talk without being seen. They look, in other words, like somebody who genuinely cares for you. That's the handler, not the gun, not the dead drop, but it's the relationship. And this episode is about all three of those type of men. It's about a Dutch colonel named Colonel Hans Valk, who loved Suriname so much that he toasted a coup that he wasn't supposed to know about. It's about a Dutch commando chief named Bas van Tussenbroek who trained a young paratrooper through his first jump and told him to keep his eyes closed the whole time because he was there, because he noticed, and because that's what a man who's cultivating a trainee does. And it's about a third man who showed up on a judo mat in the late 1960s and didn't stop showing up for another 40 years. By the end of this episode, you're going to know exactly how an intelligence asset is made. Not the Hollywood kind of version of it, but the real one. The one that looks like friendship, that feels like a mentorship, and it functions like ownership. And you're going to have a very different understanding of why two men, a coup leader and the man that ended that coup, both signed their photographs to the same Dutch colonel, grateful in remembrance of their time together. He kept both of them. Think about that. In February 1980, Bouterse looked like the perfect controllable asset. 3 weeks before Bouterse's coup, the Suriname's leftist People's Party, the Volksparty, was poised to make history. Led by Ruben Liepau-Sam, a physician who had imported Marxist ideology from Dutch universities, the party was convinced it would win the upcoming March 27, 1980 elections. Colonel Hans Valk, head of the Dutch military mission, was explicit about the danger. He warned military intelligence of the leftist threat that was threatening Suriname, specifically naming Harvey Narendorp of the People's Party as a national security concern. Now, Americans shared this concern. There was a pro-Cuban party winning legitimately a democratic election in South America's northeast coast, commanding the approaches of the Southern Caribbean where half of America's oil imports was passing. That was just unacceptable. Liepau-Sam had become like a citizen guru, a professor type person to the most radical NCOs in the Suriname military, Sergeant Sital, Minjals, and Stanley Joman. So these men were not just union organizers. They were Marxist ideologues who pushed for closer ties with Cuba. Because Sam believed that the sergeant's coup would be disadvantageous for their electoral prospects, after all, they were going to win, right? He explicitly summoned Sergeant Chaz Minjal, and he gave him instructions to stop the impending takeover. He advised them to wait until after the elections, and his strategy was to only take military actions if the elections brought back the old corrupt mob to power instead of the People's Party, which would have been a really good plan, assuming that the election would have taken place. In his book, Coup in Suriname, Dutch journalist Henk Boom tells a wild behind-the-scenes story about the 1980 takeover of the Suriname government. At the time, Prime Minister Henk Aaron was worried that he was going to lose the next election. He saw the writing on the wall of what Sam saw too. He was going down, the leftists were going to win. According to Boom, Aaron actually wanted a group of rebellious soldiers, the sergeants, to start trouble in the streets, and his secret plan was to use that rebellion as an excuse to declare an emergency, to cancel the elections, and to stay in power forever. He was essentially trying to trap the soldiers into giving him a reason to take total control. However, the plan backfired. The soldiers, led by Desi Bouterse, acted faster than Aaron had expected and pulled off their own successful coup first. As the article puts it, Aaron ended up becoming a victim of the very coup that he was trying to carry out himself. So the year 1980 kicked off with this military union standoffs. Sital, Need, Ramon Abrams, they were all arrested for mutiny. Their February 20th trial became this flashpoint. The military prosecutor demanded 10 months imprisonment and dishonorable discharge. The verdict was scheduled for February 26th. Bouterse's February 25th coup preempted all of that before the conviction and the election. So the irony of the whole thing was perfect. You have Liepau-Sam, he had actually opposed Bouterse's coup. He had ordered his proteges to stop their own coup, told them to wait till after the elections he expected to win. And when Bouterse had asked Liepau-Sam for his support on the eve of the coup, the doctor had indignantly rejected him, arguing that a military takeover was doomed to fail and it would jeopardize their party's electoral chances. So by refusing to participate, Liepau-Sam had lost his chance to lead. The coup he tried to stop preempted the election that he intended to win. And Bouterse, well, he did exactly what his handlers like Hans Valk wanted. He ended up consolidating power by immediately, within a couple months, arresting his leftist rivals, Sital, Minjels, and Joman, in August of 1980 and charging them with the left-wing coup plot and holding pro-Cuba sympathies. So we'll get to that later. But the move was interpreted by the outsiders as a clear swing to the right for Bouterse. He called the arrest of these members, Sital and Minjels, a cleansing of the ultra-left elements who have been aware for years of the deep desires of the Surinamese people. So by jailing the Marxist faction, Bouterse continued Dutch development aid and positioned himself as this moderate nationalist. The CIA, the Dutch intelligence, they viewed him as someone they could work with, or at least someone who was preferable to the communists. And for 8 months or so, it worked. Bouterse played the moderate. He worked with Henk Chinnasen, who was the Western American-approved civilian leader. He kept the radicals in prison. He maintained the appearance of democratic transition. And then everything changed. By mid-1981, Bouterse started to get enamored with these revolutionaries. You had Castro, you had Maurice Bishop, you had Daniel Ortega, and he started thinking, maybe I could be a revolutionary too. And he ended up tilting leftward instead of staying moderate. And so this asset that the machinery had encouraged to prevent leftist takeover was becoming a leftist threat himself. And that's when the whole Gladio infrastructure had to reactivate, not only to cover up the 1980 coup actions, but to correct it, to remove an asset who had gone rogue and replace him with somebody a little bit more controllable. But Bouterse proved a little bit smarter than the machinery had expected. He had acquired his own leverage. He had built his own networks. He had survived these removal attempts that should have worked. And by the time you get to the December murders, they weren't just paranoid brutality. They were Bouterse's elimination of the Western backup government before the next coup attempt could succeed. And we'll get to proving that even further. So when we're evaluating whether Suriname in the early 1980s matches a Gladio signature, remember, we're not just looking at the methodologies that were used. Those are just the tactics there. We're looking at what happens when the methodology fails, when the asset, Bouterse, recognizes the game that's being played, what's being done to him, and decides to fight back, and when the genie won't go back in the bottle. So what makes this story a little different from Italy or Belgium or places like that is in those cases, the Gladio machine stayed in control. In Suriname, the machine lost control of its own asset, and then they had to watch him survive everything that they threw at him. But let's rewind the tape. You don't have to listen to me. Just let the facts speak for themselves. 1974, Paramaribo. While Suriname was preparing for independence, the Dutch were preparing for a disaster. These were not your typical post-colonial anxieties. No worries about trade deals or flag ceremonies. This was visceral, raw terror. And the big question they asked was, what if they massacre us like they did in Indonesia? Now, you might be asking, what am I talking about? But the Dutch population in Suriname was about 40,000 strong in 1974, and it was genuinely terrified of what might happen on November 25th, 1975, Independence Day. It was the day the Netherlands would formally relinquish control of its old 300-year-old colony. And the Dutch remembered Indonesia, and how could they forget? You see, after World War II ended, the Dutch and the British made this secret deal with the Japanese that they could keep their weapons and they could act as a temporary police force, ordering the surrendered troops to protect European civilians and key infrastructure against the brutal violence of the Indonesian nationalist movement. Didn't work. The Bersiap periods, which was from September 1945 to December 1946, it became this nightmare of revenge killings and mass rapes and targeted murders of Dutch citizens and anybody who was a perceived collaborator with machetes and bamboo spears and the cry of Bersiap, which meant be prepared. Now, the exact death toll will never be known, but estimates range from anywhere from 3,500 to 30,000 victims. And the massacre of Dutch civilians at Surabaya on September 28, 1945, that left hundreds dead alone just in that one event. So the Indonesian revolutionaries, they didn't just attack the Dutch colonial administrators. They went after anyone who was associated with Dutch colonial power. You had Eurasians, which were Indo people. You had Chinese merchants. You had Ambonese soldiers who had served in the colonial army, mixed race families. Anybody who had benefited or cooperated with Dutch rule became a target. So the violence was intimate and brutal. Families pulled from their homes, public executions, bodies dumped in rivers and mass graves. It was the kind of ethnic cleansing that haunts the nation's memories for generations. And as tragic as the Bersiap period was, it would be dwarfed by what would follow as the Dutch military launched a massive war to take back its former colony. While the Bersiap period was a tragedy, the Dutch response was even more violent. During the 4 years that followed, an estimated 300,000 Indonesians were killed, including many who were executed without a trial. So to put it into perspective, somewhere between 3,500 and 30,000 people died on the Dutch side of things, and that meant for every one Dutch casualty, roughly 50 Indonesians lost their lives. And the Netherlands still calls these battles police actions to avoid calling them war crimes. But for many, it was a brutal war that would leave deep scars on both nations. So when Suriname approached independence in 1974-75, the Dutch population there, many of whom were Indonesian war refugees or their children, looked at what was coming and thought, it's going to happen again. The demographic numbers told this frightening story. The Dutch were a minority in Suriname, a lot smaller than the indigenous and Creole, Hindustani, Javanese, Chinese communities who had been exploited for centuries under colonial rule. So Independence Day could justifiably be a revenge day. And by the mid-1970s, the Dutch authorities were privately frustrated as well with how Surinamese ethnically based political parties had practiced parliamentary democracy. Their $3.5 billion golden package of development aid wasn't being used productively. There was corruption allegations and nepotism, and the former colony wasn't developing as prosperously as they had hoped, and they were partly to blame. These frustrations, which are documented in internal ministry communications, they would later raise uncomfortable questions as to whether Dutch intelligence may have wanted a moderate military alternative like a Bouterse just to hit the reset button on what they saw was a failing democratic experience. So as Suriname's independence was approaching, Dutch civilians were fleeing in massive numbers. By the end of 1975, an estimated 40% of the population, nearly 140,000 people, would relocate to the Netherlands. It was the Great Exodus, the hemorrhaging of an entire society. And the Dutch military watched the exodus with growing alarm, haunted by the Guyana precedent where neighboring ethnic strife had recently spiraled into a race war. So this wasn't merely theoretical paranoia. The ground in Paramaribo was already burning, with political arsonists targeting government buildings and daily reports of strikes and sexual violence. And the military feared a panic emigration would ignite a total societal collapse. So they began asking the unthinkable. What if the departing colonizers became the primary targets of this erupting rage? To prevent a repeat of the Bersiap massacres in Indonesia, the Ministry of Defense realized that hope was no longer a strategy. They needed a hard contingency plan. Thus, the secret protocols of Operation Black Tulip were born. Colonel Martin Forley had been appointed Bouterse, which was the commander-in forces of Suriname, in October 1st, 1974. He understood the fear. He had served in Suriname between 1955 and 1959, when his eldest daughter had been born in Paramaribo. So he knew the people, he knew the tensions, he knew what independence anxiety looked like from the inside. So Forley tasked his assistant, Adjutant Ted Westerlaar, with drafting a contingency plan. According to Westerlaar, someone who knew Suriname could put it together on paper in about 5 minutes. So that initial draft didn't exactly meet Forley's wishes. He wanted it scaled up to handle larger scale civil unrest. So remember this idea that a Dutch contingency plan might be subject to revisions, that was there from the inception. The official name for Black Tulip was the Emergency Protocol 1975, which is bureaucratic language for, oh shit, time to get everybody out. The military archives were listed under a more formal name, Operatie Plan NR.75HOO. But Colonel Forley called it Zwart Tulip, or Black Tulip, a name that carried in it some kind of a dark irony. See, tulips were Holland's symbol. They were exported worldwide as emblems of Dutch commerce and prosperity. You see tulips, you think Dutch success story. But a black tulip, that's kind of the opposite. It's something that's corrupted, something wrong, an evacuation rather than a celebration of independence, darkness instead of color. The stated purpose of the plan was clear. It was a defensive measure for protecting and evacuating Dutch nationals and Surinamese with Dutch nationality in the event of anti-Dutch riots during the independence transfer. So it was not an offensive coup plot. The plan established joint command under Cortes with available resourcing, including trees, the Tropenmacht in Suriname, the Royal Netherlands Navy units, Royal Netherlands Fleet units from the Netherlands Antilles, a mobile company from the Netherlands, and a Royal Netherlands Marechaussee detachment, and a Marine Corps company just for good measure. It also had a critical activation protocol. Only if the government of Suriname, Johan Ferrier, requested the assistance. And we need to remember that trigger. So training exercises began in 1975. At least 12 exercises were down at the football field on the Memrebuku barracks, now at the Army Museum location. There were rioters that were dressed up in old civilian clothes, given crates of rotten fruit to throw. Dutch soldiers were given wicker shields and batons, practicing crowd control. But the details were something else. So Adjutant Vestelaar, the man who had drafted the plan, was also a sports diver by hobby. When you read the Black Tulip documents today, it doesn't seem like a complex military strategy from some high-level military academy. Instead, it reads like the work of a colonel's assistant who spent his weekends and holidays handling office logistics. So despite of that, it was a professional tactical checklist. Instead of using secret codes or military codes like Alpha Bravo, the Dutch used real names like Sandre and Zorp and Hoop and specific radio stations. So if you knew Paramaribo, the plan kind of worked like a street map. The airport was the operational center, the only place that could handle the heavy transport planes that were needed to fly out 6,000 Dutch citizens to safety. The plan labeled it as a vital object that had to be seized for safe withdrawal. They also had a backup, which was the Zorgenhoop, the small airfield in the city. It was too small for the really big planes, but it was critical because it had the military ammunition complex. So seizing it ensured that the opponents couldn't use it and get bullets to use against the Dutch forces. So finally, the plan included like these choke points. Since the main river bridge hadn't really been built yet, the military aimed to control the ferries and the canal bridges. The plan was so granular, it even told families how many sets of underwear to pack. 3. So think about that for a moment. There's 3 sets of underwear, 2 bath towels. That was what the Dutch state was telling its colonial families to prepare for in case everything went wrong in Suriname, the official emergency protocol for Dutch subjects in a former colony. Meanwhile, the men who write these protocols, the men who ran the intelligence networks that had decided when or where to activate it, they had been quietly preparing their own families for decades, not just underwear. They had gold bars and Swiss bank facilities, observed by their children on family trips in the early 1960s, escape routes through France and through Spain, verified every 2 years under the cover of organized camping rallies. Those rallies were real. They've been documented in the organization's own administration history. So they had bank accounts in San Sebastian and Bilbao and Geneva. They had convoy troops, 7 to 10 cars, routes memorized, secondary roads only, safe houses. The October 1962 Cuba crisis had been the rehearsal for all this. Families packed up and they were ready within hours. They had their winter coats, they had their sleeping bags, they had jerry cans full of fuel, and the children were told not to ask where they were going. So Operation Black Tulip was what the Dutch state prepared for other people. The stay-behind apparatus was what it prepared for itself. So this kind of level of real-world detail is why people later accused Colonel Valk of handing the plan to Bouterse. It provided a ready-made to-do list to paralyze the country in a single morning. The investigative journalists from Vrije Nederlands, Elma Verhey and Gerard van Westerlo, they kind of sensationalized the whole plan by alleging that it was all racially motivated. They claimed that the plan covered all Dutch passport holders for as far as they were white-skinned, and it was designed to prevent white bloodshed. So we'll come back to that shortly, but what the plan was, it was thorough, it was professional, it's exactly what you would expect from Dutch military planning. It addressed logistics and security and communication contingencies. It even included like a psychological operations protocol, how to manage panic, how to prevent stampedes and maintain order amongst terrified civilians. And then it all got filed away. Independence Day arrived, the HRMS Rotterdam, the Antilles destroyer, was positioned in the Suriname River. It was decorated with festive flags, appearing ceremonial. But it was actually a part of Black Tulip. The Dutch Marines were ready to assist if riots occurred. Last-minute changes had been made to Black Tulip that weren't known to all parties. Vestelaar, who had drafted the original plans, didn't even know that the ship was part of his own operations. As he later said, quote, "I carried Voorle's briefcase, so to speak. I had no idea that the HRMS Rotterdam was part of his Black Tulip plan." So there were changes that were made to Black Tulip on a need-to-know basis. But no disaster ever came. No massacres, no riots, no anti-Dutch violence. The worst fears had proven unfounded. Haperen became prime minister of an independent Suriname, and the remaining Dutch population settled into an uncertain but non-violent coexistence with the new government. Operation Black Tulip became obsolete the moment independence was achieved without bloodshed. The terror that had driven 140,000 people to flee turned out to be largely unfounded. Suriname's transition to sovereignty, while not perfect, did not descend into ethnic violence, which the Dutch had feared. And Black Tulip, well, according to standard protocol, it should have been destroyed or archived. Now here's the problem. You don't just leave top secret military plans for a now independent ally sitting around in filing cabinets, especially not plans that map out exactly how to seize airports, control bridges, and occupy radio stations. The risk is exactly what would eventually happen. Someone could dust off those outdated protocols and use them again for something completely different. 2 days after independence, Tris, T-R-I-S, officially disbanded at Schiphol Airport. The archive, including Black Tulip, was transferred to the Netherlands. Jaap Vreken, Vestelaar's successor as Captain Adjutant, testified. The Tris archive was also on the plane. I'm certain of that, because we didn't want to leave any important documents behind because the relationship with Colonel Elstak wasn't great. There was uncertainty to the very last day about whether Elstak would become the commander of SKM. He had quite a few demands. And multiple archives have confirmed the location. You have the Netherlands Institute for Military History, NIMH, a copy of the instructions and operational plan. You have the National Archives in The Hague, another numbered version of both documents. Then another one at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a copy discovered in the archives there during research. The Ministry of Defense, the Tris archive, transferred from Schiphol Airport on November 27, 1975. So Black Tulip served its purpose. Independence went peacefully. The fear of another Bersiap didn't materialize. The plan could be filed away as a successful contingency planning that never needed execution. Or so everybody thought. In this case, someone kept a copy, maybe even multiple copies. Years later, Colonel Marsevain, Valk's successor and rival, shared his theory with reporter Gerard van Westerlo. These are Westerlo's notes, which were found by Ellen de Vries in an archive from a July 1983 conversation. And I quote, Bouterse knows that plan too. It should have been destroyed November 25th, 1980, probably meant November 25th, 1975. His coup, Bouterse's, is the reverse Black Tulip. I've always had the idea that a copy must have been left behind. Did Valk give that plan to Bouterse? Did you catch that? His coup, Bouterse's, is the reverse of Black Tulip. Westerlo's speculation wasn't just that Valk had kept a copy of the evacuation plan. He is saying that Bouterse used it as a tactical blueprint, just reversed it, flipped the script. Instead of the Dutch forces using it to seize Surinamese infrastructure during an evacuation, Surinamese forces flipped the script and used it to seize their own infrastructure during the coup. So whether Hans Valk kept his own copy, marked it all up with notes, and used it for training became the central question that would drive decades of investigation up until today. But there is one thing that is for certain, and that is the plan existed. If you read Ellen de Vries' book, Hans Valk, which you should because it is the preeminent kind of standard for covering this period, you'll hear her challenge what became accepted wisdom, that the 1980 coup was based upon a Dutch military blueprint, which was called Operation Black Tulip. Through her extensive research into the Dutch archives, this has poked some serious holes into what reporters Gerald van Westerlo and Elma Verhey have claimed. So here's basically her case as I read it. Ellen, if you're watching this, feel free to comment and correct me in the notes. So there's really no smoking gun. Sure, Black Tulip existed, Valk would have known about it, but there's no hard proof that he ever possessed a copy or handed an annotated copy over to Bouterse. Secondly, there's some questionable sources. The Van Westerlo and Verhey story relied on a small circle of informants who kept repeating the same types of claims. So that was likely Colonel Marsefane, Peter Meyer, who we talked about at the beginning, Andre Hochmont. So it's not exactly full independent confirmation or verification. Also, there's some political theater that's involved. You have Colonel Schulte, who called the theory pre-cooked. It was an effort to force a parliamentary inquiry by leaking some intelligence reports. So notes in Van Westerlo's archives suggest that the story may have been a little premeditated, had some political motivations behind it. So there's also the fact that it's militarily illogical. So Black Tulip was designed to use the Dutch Navy and the Marines. The Suriname sergeant didn't have access to those assets. So how could you execute a plan requiring ships that you don't have? It was the wrong kind of plan. Evacuation plans get people out. Coup manuals take over governments. So they're fundamentally different. Black Tulip wouldn't contain instructions on neutralizing the police forces, which the sergeants definitely did. The other factor is the misunderstood racial angle that we talked about before. One claim that gained a lot of traction was that Black Tulip was racist, that it was designed to protect only the white Dutch citizens while using white forces to neutralize what they called the colored part of the military. De Vries dismantles this last argument pretty thoroughly. The evacuation list included international VIPs of all races. They were delegates from Cuba and Mexico and Guinea and Indonesia, and it covered Governor Ferrier's Afro-Surinamese family, the Indo-Dutch Trees members, the mixed race families, the white soldiers married to black women and mixed children. So the language about moderately reliable units wasn't about race, and that's terminology in the report. It was more about the chain of command during the handover. As the Dutch Trees became Surinamese, who would the soldiers end up obeying? The Dutch commander Forley or the new commander Elstak? Former officers who were actually there, they also rejected that racial interpretation entirely. So you had Hugo Fernandez Mendez, who he said plainly, if Elstak says go right and Forley says go left, I'd obey Elstak. I can't make it more exciting than it is. There's also the critique of cherry-picked evidence. De Vries argues that the journalists selectively used certain quotes and ignored anything that didn't fit their Dutch conspiracy theory. she makes some pretty strong points here. Her research is really some of the best on Black Tulip, and I've relied heavily on it. If you go back and read the Substack, which I suggest you should, check out the original sources, you're going to see her work there cited a lot. And then there's a journalistic problem. So there's a little bit of academic backstory that you should know about when you're reading Van Westerlo and Verhees' reporting. Their first major article appeared 10 days after the December murders, which happened on December 8th, 1982. But their most explosive piece was titled "The Dutch Military Mission Brought Bouterse to Power," and it wasn't published until 2 days before Christmas in 1982. So that's the one that claims that Valk provided the blueprint. So follow-up articles kept coming. You had Colonel Valk and his Hague protection, January 15th, 1983. Another piece on July 30th, 1983, publishing leaked secret intelligence reports that supposedly confirmed everything. These were compiled into a book called The Army Green Suriname. That's the English translation because I'm going to butcher the Dutch. And that was published in 1983. It's kind of a collection of all of these different articles. So you should also know that Gerard van Westerlo and Elma Verhees were close personal friends to the murdered Surinamese journalist and former spokesperson for the National Military Council, the NMR, Josef Slagveer. So he was a victim of the December murders. He was tortured. He had severe head injuries. He was forced to read a confession on camera, confessing to a counter plot involving foreign help, the same one that Peter van Haperen was claiming to be behind. And then they executed him. So the torture and the killing of their friend, Joseph, drove Van Westerlo and Verhees to investigate, quote, how it could have come to this. And that fundamental question made them never let go, like pit bulls. It became the motor driving their work. So when Ellen de Vries notes that they were little critical of sources providing secret documents and that they ignored evidence that didn't fit into their formed image, yeah, that's the context. It was grief-driven journalism, relentless pursuit of answers about a murdered friend. And to be fair, there is a little bit of tunnel vision in their work, but there's also some really spectacular journalism, primary sources, and interviews that would not have otherwise existed without their efforts. And that also has to be examined, and I also have used a lot of their works in my citations as well. Either way, Ellen de Vries' research is excellent, but her position, in my opinion, requires us to believe some things that I find highly improbable. So there are two intelligence officers who I think were very competent, which was Colonel Marsevain and Peter Meyer. They were both trained in counterintelligence. They had made a career out of this. They had those careers to protect. It was their livelihood. They had families to support, and they both independently committed career suicide and risked their health over a simple misunderstanding. That's what we are to believe. That they were too blinded by their own personal vendetta, that they were too mentally unstable, that they couldn't distinguish the difference between an evacuation plan and evidence of a coup involvement. I don't know. I just don't know. They were not journalists who were chasing a story. These were professional intelligence officers whose whole job was evaluating documents and assessing threats for a living. Marsevain had supervised Bureau Suriname for over a decade. Meyer had worked in counterintelligence in Warsaw and in Bonn. And they both destroyed their careers. Over what? A personal beef with Valk? Misreading an evacuation plan and misreading the room on what was going on in the Dutch military mission? And here's the thing that I don't fully get Ellen reckoning with, which is while Marsevain was later officially walking back his most explosive claims to the Prompt Commission who investigated Valk's involvement, he was saying not to attach too much value to it. The MIVD's own archives show that he was simultaneously feeding Dutch journalists the exact same coup involvement story. Frustrated about being pushed out of Suriname, feeling that he still had an axe to grind. So that doesn't sound like a man who's officially changed his mind. That's a man who's telling the commission one thing and telling the press another. And Kunduz did the same thing. He walked his story back officially. Then years later, he sat in front of a camera and said that he'd found in 1991 was that the Dutch were involved. You know, that the person on the ground knew, right? So it's just a reversal. The second track is saying out loud what he'd been saying all along. And as we'll see, they weren't confused. They weren't bitter enough to ruin their entire careers. These were professionals that were operating under certain constraints that required them to tell a certain version of events, until which time those constraints were lifted. And then the other version came out.
And there's another issue, which is De Vries doesn't really examine the evidence around Gladio or the American operation lens. And that's not a critique of hers. That was just understandable. That is outside the purview of what she was writing about in that book, Hans Valk. In her endnotes, she mentions consulting the CIA archives and the CREST database during her research, and explicitly notes it yielded very few details on Suriname. And that's where we can help, right? So we can add some of the missing pieces to that puzzle. We can build on top of her research. And when we do that, some really interesting things start to emerge. So let's go ahead and put Black Tulip back in the archives for just a minute here, because what, in my opinion, matters isn't necessarily whether Valk handed Bouterse a marked up evacuation plan. I'll grant that. What matters is why someone like Valk or Bouterse or their handlers would have had interest in dusting off an old manual and protocols like that in the first place. And we also should remember what Van Westerlo and Verhey warned us after the December murders, which was this: it is therefore advisable to pay attention not only to Valk and his associates, but also their protectors in The Hague. Their protectors in The Hague. Let's talk about that for a second. Colonel Hans Valk arrived in Paramaribo in 1975 with a reputation. He was the Netherlands' answer to Lawrence of Arabia, people said. He was a soldier who understood foreign cultures. He could operate in messy situations. He had the people skills to be able to navigate post-colonial relationships without making everybody end up hating you. And the Dutch government needed somebody like that. They also needed somebody that they could trust. And while Colonel Valk was not a royal himself, he was connected to the innermost sanctum of the royal court through his father. He was the son of General C.J. Valk, a high-ranking military official who served as a military attaché in Indonesia. Remember, we talked about what was going on there. And as adjutant aide-de-camp to the Queen herself. So beyond his royal service, the elder Valk held pivotal roles in the Cold War defense structure. He's serving as the deputy chief of staff at NATO headquarters and for the Allied forces in Central Europe and in Fontainebleau, before he got appointed to territory commander of the Netherlands in 1957. So the relationship with Suriname was tricky. You're the former colonial power, and you're trying to keep influence without looking like you're trying to control them, right? So it's a delicate balance. The 7-person military mission had an official job. It was to professionalize Tries, to provide training to the military in Suriname, to help get weapons and gear, to keep official ties strong. Now, unofficially, the mission was intelligence collections. They were the eyes and ears for The Hague to figure out who it was who really holds power in Suriname, to track political developments, to watch for threats to Dutch interests. Now, Valk was perfect for both roles. He was charming and outgoing. He's the kind of guy who could make friends anywhere and get people talking without them even realizing that they were telling him things. Within months, he had built these relationships across Surinamese society. Military officers and politicians, business leaders, the Dutch expat community. Everybody liked Valk. Everybody trusted him, especially the non-commissioned officers who would eventually overthrow the government. So Sergeant Major Desi Bouterse, Captain Roy Horb, Lieutenant Henk Fernandez, these weren't generals or colonels yet. They were just guys actually running things, getting stuff done. Now, meanwhile, their superiors were collecting paychecks and playing politics at Paramaribo social clubs. Falk spent time with the NCOs. He was drinking with them at the officers' club. He had beers with them on his own patio. He would discuss military tactics. He would listen to their complaints about the corrupt Haperen regime and their incompetent commanders. So the Dutch colonel understood something that the Surinamese generals didn't. Real powers belonged to the NCOs, who controlled the barracks and the enlisted men, not the officers who controlled all the paperwork. So think of what happened next, like a Cold War version of Dances with Wolves. I don't know if you've seen that movie with Kevin Costner or not, but I'm showing my age. The Dutch military mission was supposed to last only about 5 years. They were going to train the Surinamese army and professionalize them and then go home. But instead of maintaining that professional distance, the Dutch officers did exactly what Kevin Costner's character did. They went native. And back in The Hague, they called it being Surinamized, meaning you were more loyal to Bouterse than to your own government, more Surinamese than you were Dutch.
After independence in 1975, Suriname asked the Netherlands to keep the military mission around to continue training the army.
When Suriname gained independence, the Surinamese government was allowed to nominate a candidate to head the military mission, and they explicitly had requested Colonel Marsefane.
There's a couple things you should know about Marsefane. First of all, he wasn't the flashy choice. He's like the opposite of flashy. If Valk was the Netherlands' answer to Lawrence of Arabia, a soldier who worked the room like a party host and made everybody feel like they're your friends, Marsefane was the man Valk gave nightmares about. He was a career intelligence officer. Marsefane was very precise and formal, the kind of man that likes to write everything down. So he had started in colonial Indonesia in the late 1940s and was a 20-year-old reserve lieutenant with the 9th Field Artillery Division at the tail end of the Second Police Action. So in December of 1948, during the Dutch assault on Yogyakarta, he had been assigned guard duty for 3 of the most consequential prisoners in Dutch colonial history. You had President Sukarno, the former Prime Minister Sultan Syrir, and the Foreign Minister Haji Aga Salim. So for 10 days in a mountain village called Berestagi, 1,500 meters above the jungle, Marsefane managed the tension between his own soldiers who wanted to shoot his prisoners and call it an escape attempt, and then the institutional requirement to keep them alive. So the UN Security Council was simultaneously demanding their release, and the international press was watching, and any mistake he made would have been catastrophic, and he didn't make one. He was quoted by a newspaper saying, "I kept thinking, for God's sake, let nothing happen to them," he'd later tell a journalist. "Let's make sure we can pass this on in a proper manner." So that was a really formative experience, the gap between what the soldiers want to do and what the institutions require of them. And Marsefane spent the next 3 decades living in that gap professionally. New Guinea in the late 1950s as another Dutch colonial position unraveled, then into the CID, which was the Dutch Military Counterintelligence Service, their internal watchdog organization. So the people responsible for making sure that the Dutch officers don't go rogue and they don't fraternize inappropriately and cross the lines that the institutions draw. So for years, he had ran that. He didn't work just inside of it. He ran that. He was the head of Dutch counter-military intelligence. So this is a man whose job was catching exactly the kind of officer that Hans Valk was becoming in Paramaribo. So in 1975, when the Dutch gained independence and the Dutch government asked Paramaribo to nominate a candidate to head the new military mission, they nominated him. Made sense, right? Which he knew the country. He had the intelligence background. He understood the whole post-colonial dynamics from Indonesia. He'd spent a career making sure that military operations stayed within institutional bounds. And so nobody ever fully explained why he didn't get the job, and the Surinamese government was rightfully furious
They've been told they would have a say, and the say that they gave was overruled. And former mission members would later note that Marcifane flushed red every time he would hear Valk's name being mentioned. And you probably would too if your whole career was built on the principle that officers who fraternize inappropriately with foreign militaries and outside their mandate and develop private relationships that compromise the institution's role, if those officers get caught, they should be held accountable. And The Hague had just handed your job over to a guy like that, to what would nowadays be considered like a Nepo baby, before the problem even got started. So the son of Colonel C.J. Valk, who had served as a military attaché to the Queen and held senior NATO posts connected to the innermost sanctum of the royal court, this wasn't about qualifications in Marcifane's rendering of the situation. This is just about whose family you came from. Marcifane and Valk, they possessed fundamentally incompatible working styles. Marcifane was highly formal, buttoned up, precise, strictly a bureau man, a desk officer with a background in military intelligence with the S2 branch. In contrast, Valk was a little looser. He was flamboyant. He was informal, a Tropenmann, a field or troop officer who cultivated a jovial old boys network relationship with the Surinamese military. Marcifane abhorred Valk's popular behavior and his informal approach. While Valk enjoyed a cozy, whiskey-fueled friendship with Desi Bouterse and the Surinamese non-commissioned officers, Marcifane, described as a formal office man from The Hague, considered this kind of intense fraternization to be highly inappropriate and compromising for the Netherlands. So that's all the backdrop, and keep that in mind, because everything that follows, Marcifane watching Valk go native, Marcifane arriving in 1980 to clean up the mess, Marcifane predicting the December murders 16 months before they happened, and watching his report on the situation disappear into a minister's desk, all of that has its origins right here in a 1975 decision that told the man whose job was institutional accountability that accountability didn't apply to the right kind of people. And just one more thing to keep in mind, Marcifane didn't just supervise counterintelligence for years, his subordinates knew him. There was a major named Koenders who worked under him at the CID, a thorough, methodical investigator, the kind of man you would send in to document something that you already knew was there. And you'll meet him again here soon. So the Dutch military mission was really only supposed to last 5 years. And Captain Kees Briere, he joined as an engineer. And The Hague gave him a lot of freedom, complete freedom, early on to do his work. So when he first got the job, he sent his first report back to The Hague, and nothing, crickets. So after that, the pattern became pretty standard. The Hague just got the reports, they filed them away, and the mission pretty much was running itself, basically with little oversight. Thousands of miles away from home, nobody checking in on them. Now, contemporary reports from the time documented what officials back home were seeing. I'm going to try this. Opdrachten werden niet uitgevoerd. I think orders are not carried out. There was no compliance with explicit rules. There was claims that Valk was drunk at his desk. Now, whether these characterizations are entirely fair or whether they were partially being driven by frustrated officials that were back in The Hague dealing with a far distant mission, it's really hard to assess that years later. But the pattern was real, and it was being documented as it happened real time. The mission members were getting very close to the soldiers that they trained. They were sympathizing with their complaints. They began seeing things from the perspective of the Surinamese NCOs rather than the Dutch who were paying their salaries. So the military mission, they did what they thought they were supposed to do: provide thorough training to the Surinamese so they would have a professional military within a few years. Briere said some mission members visited the barracks daily, ensuring close contact with the Surinamese military. So daily they were going there, not weekly staff meetings, not monthly check-ins. They were showing up every day. So it was that kind of constant presence builds deep relationships. It makes you part of the club. rather than an outside advisor. It turns those soldiers I'm training into my guys. And they would use this term, de jongen, I think, or like the boys, they would call them, to refer to their Surinamese non-commissioned officers who were very young. They're in their 20s, some of them were at the time. Those relationships, they were intense. So the sports program was where professional courtesy turned into something else. From 1968 to 1973, there was a sergeant named Dick Staphorst. He later became a lieutenant, and he had run the Tries Judo program. He'd organized Suriname's first judo championships in 1968 at the Prince Bernhard campment. So 7 schools competed, including a team from Tries itself. And by March of 1969, he'd earned enough respect to serve on the examination committee that awarded Suriname's first black belt. Right alongside Andre Kamperveen, one of the country's most prominent sports figures, a legend in Suriname. And he'd become one of the country's most respected martial arts authorities. You know, he was a 20-something Dutch sergeant, not Surinamese, but he was a master at martial arts. And that same year, he coached the Surinamese national judo team at an international invitational against Curaçao, guiding them to victories, earning the country's first international medal in the sport. So by 1973, Staphorst had become head of Tries Sports Bureau. He introduced indoor football. Nowadays, they'd probably call it like futsal, very similar in terms of the rules, but he introduced that to Suriname that year, organizing tournaments between Dutch soldiers and Surinamese civilians, and it became an annual tradition. So the bonds that Staphorst built were not just professional, they were physical, the kind that you form on a sweaty judo mat where trust gets tested every time you hit the ground, where rank matters less than your skill and respect. And it's not classroom lectures, it's not parade ground drills, it's the kind of training where you fall together, you test each other's limits, you earn respect through skill rather than rank. And one of his students was Desi Bouterse. So when Staphorst returned to Netherlands in 1975, he completed the military instructor course at Hoogland. Bouterse took the same course with him. They trained together. These are 2 men who'd spent years teaching the same martial art in the same country. They were now learning advanced instruction techniques side by side in the Dutch countryside. So following this training, Bouterse was asked to return to his homeland specifically to set up sport in Suriname together with the Dutchman, Dick Staphorst. So that relationship went very deep. Mentor and student, friends, the kind of bond that forms when you're learning to trust your training partner not to hurt you when you're vulnerable. Then there was Roy Botze, Suriname's golden boy. He was a Dutch-trained commissioned officer. First lieutenant, he was the kind of athlete who made everything look effortless and his country proud. Track and field champion, best in his class at the Royal Military Academy. He was an outstanding student at the military sports school at Hoogland, where in 1973 and 1974, he and Bouterse trained side by side in the same D class. Both identified immediately as exceptional performers, both selected after a competitive intake process, the men who could outrun, outsmart, and outdiscipline almost anyone in the Surinamese military. So Botze and Bouterse were childhood friends who had followed parallel paths into the Dutch military, and then at that Hoogland classroom, their shared ambition became impossible to ignore. Jan Kasper, the class instructor, still remembered the intake interview with Bouterse decades later. He said, "A remarkably modest, amiable, and somewhat timid young non-commissioned officer who knew well how to articulate his enthusiasm very well." Botze, by contrast, was remembered as flamboyant. So you had 2 men in the same room, same training, same future that were heading in seemingly opposite directions. They shared ambition. Here's the detail that tells you everything about their dynamic. At some point, Botze taught Bouterse how to be a boxing referee. Think about what that means. You have a commissioned officer, the one with rank who has the academy credentials, the constitutional authority, teaching his NCO friends the rules. How to watch a fight, when to step, when to let go. In 1980, Bouterse stopped being a referee and became the fight himself. When the coup happened, Botze fled Suriname the same day that Bouterse seized power. not because he was afraid, but because staying would have required him to collaborate with a lower NCO who had just stripped the commissioned officer in the country of their authority and of their stars. So to Bouterse, that wasn't just illegal, it was a violation of something fundamental about the order of things. So that resentment would fuel every subsequent counter coup. The Ormskirk coup potentially, but definitely the Rambocus coup, the Easter coup plot in 1983 had its roots right there. The coup with Dr. John McClure in 1984 and multiple other ones. So higher ranking officers don't just forget when a sergeant major takes their stars. And former friends and oftentimes make the most bitter enemies. So the boxing ring had given them the same foundation, but then the coup split them into separate corners.
So before we move on, there's one more figure from those Dutch years that's worth placing on the map. At Havelterberg, Drenthe, during the period when Bouterse was a platoon sergeant in the 47th Armory Infantry Battalion and living at Bischofsbergweg 15, a little further down the same street, lived another Surinamese soldier and his wife. So Paul Bagwandes and his wife Lillian. The two families were neighbors before either of the men had a rank worth speaking of. So Ingrid Bouterse and Lillian Bagwandes, they cycled together to the factory to get in the winter time without coats. They were two spirited women the neighbors remembered. So whatever bond formed between Bouterse and Bagwandes in the barracks and on that judo mat, it was cemented first on that street in the Dutch countryside in the ordinary proximity of neighboring families living ordinary lives. And years later, when Bagwandes led the execution squad at Fort Zeelandia, and the newspapers called him the executioner of Paramaribo, the neighbors from in Havelterberg who remembered those winters could find it impossible to square those two images. So now back to our story. But there was a third man who was on the mats that nobody really paid much attention to at the time. In 1969, a young Dutch conscript was transferred from the 4th Platoon Bravo, where he had been working as a Bren gunner, to the Tree Sports Bureau to assist with physical training instruction. Now, he wasn't an officer, but he was, by his very own account, a low-level conscript with an exceptional memory and enough promise as a martial artist to make himself useful to Dick Staphorst. And his name was Peter van Haperen. So this is the same Peter van Haperen who would show up at Dick Staphorst's door 13 years later, claiming to be a Dutch military intelligence operative with the CID, which is the Counterintelligence Division. Now, this is the same Peter van Haperen who would infiltrate the Surinamese resistance in 1982 and 1983, and the same Peter van Haperen who would testify in 2009 that he had known about coup plots from his intelligence work back in the 80s. If Van Haperen was indeed Staphorst's assistant, and the detail is specific enough, down to his alleged service registration number, down to his assignment, to suggest that he had direct knowledge, then he was on those mats during those exact years where that martial arts network was being built. So he wasn't a spy at first, he was just a helper. He had watched Staphorst work with the same NCOs who would later stage a coup 12-some years later. He knew their names, he understood the bonds. Reporters Verhey and Van Westerlo confirmed this in 1983 that Van Haperen was indeed a conscript corporal and a judo instructor in Suriname in the late 1960s. Van Haperen himself claims that during that period, Captain D. Dickie Meckering and Major K. Bavenik, head of S2 Tries, recruited him for sensitive work. Bavenik's been documented in September of 1969 as the lead Dutch military intelligence expert on the ground during the Tigray border conflict. So the precise time and the precise place that Van Haperen says that he served in Suriname. So whether that makes Van Haperen a legitimate S2 asset running intelligence operations under Sports Bureau cover, or just simply a young conscript who later embellished his service history with enough real names and verifiable details to make it all plausible, that's the kind of question that has plagued him and defined his credibility for the next 4 decades. But what isn't in dispute here is that he was there, on the mat, in the network, in the same room where it happened. 3 men on the same mat,
One would train the dictator, Staphorst. One would flee the country on the day of the coup and spend years trying to undo it in Batza. And one would disappear into the resistance only to surface when the machinery needed him, Van Haperen. So the sergeants who would later stage the coup, Bouterse, Horb, Fernandez, they all moved through that world. Physical training, martial arts, sports instruction. When Bouterse later completed the Dutch military sport instruction course at Hoogland, he was following a path that Staphorst had mapped out. Quote, "We as the mission members had great influence on those boys." That is Vries admitted. The plural possessive form matters here. He's saying we, not I. It wasn't just one rogue officer. This is how the whole mission worked. And the influence went both ways. Now, Colonel Valk had a pattern that everybody noticed. When Valk had 2 drinks in him, intelligence reports would later note he made his heart no secret. After 2 drinks, the diplomat disappeared and the trooper emerged. This is the man who would call Commander Elstak a wimp or a playboy who couldn't command 2 soldiers. The officer who would suggestively discuss with NCOs what really needed to happen. This wasn't accidental loose talk. This was predictable. It's also exploitable. It's the kind of pattern that stay-behind handlers learn to recognize and use in assets, but also to remove in employees with loose lips. And the NCOs, Bouterse, Horb, and others, visited Valk at his home regularly. Quote, under the enjoyment of a drink and a snack, as intelligence reports would later delicately phrase it. Reasonable, intensive contact, fate-bound relationships, all lubricated with alcohol. And then you had Orlando's coffee shop on Kirkplain, which actually was Hotel Orlando, had an outdoor terrace, and it became something of a military hangout. It also became documented as an intelligence infrastructure. It wasn't a secret, it wasn't hidden. Everybody knew what happened there, and that was kind of the point. So at Orlando's terrace is where the whole pay gap became very visible and very humiliating for some people. You had lower ranking corporals who had served in the Dutch army who received supplemental pay, and they could afford to buy rounds of drinks for everybody. Large jugs of Parbo, Diogo, they called it. Meanwhile, higher-ranking Surinamese soldiers and sergeants like Ruben Rosendahl couldn't afford the same. And imagine what that dynamic probably would be like every night. You got the Dutch-connected guys buying beers for everybody, and then the local leadership is being humiliated by their own poverty. So that disparity is impossible to ignore when it's measured in who can afford to buy another round. So Bouterse himself was part of this culture. He and Horb visited Valk at his home regularly, and Bouterse even took up the habit of drinking whiskey, which is one of the favorite drinks of his mentor. So while Valk's wife denied that he drank on duty during work, she did admit that the military men drink a lot generally. So this wasn't just recreational drinking. This is where the politics was happening, where the lines got blurred, where resentments crystallized, where plotting occurred. Then, according to Major Koender's confidential investigation, Valk had been systematic about his recruitment too. He first approached a group of young officers in 1979. So Lieutenants Roy Botza, Caro, Michel, Van Rey, and Vert. So these are men who had trained in the Netherlands, who understood Dutch military culture, who they seemed like natural candidates to lead a professional takeover. But when they refused, Valk shifted his focus to the dissatisfied non-commissioned officers, the working class soldiers with genuine grievances, the ones who actually were running the barracks and while their superiors were collecting paychecks and buying rounds of beer. But here's what most accounts get wrong. The coup's initiator was not Desi Bouterse. It was actually Roy Horb. Journalist Wilhelm Otmans, who has some really wild connections to the JFK assassination story, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, he stated it explicitly. He said not Bouterse, but Roy Horb was the originator of the coup in 1980. So this matters because Horb wasn't just ambitious, he was also highly impressionable. Until 1982, Roy Horb had never traveled outside of Suriname. He'd never seen a skyscraper. He had the kind of naive personality that could be cultivated influenced, and recruited. So 2 years later, the CIA would successfully turn Horb into an asset, penetrating Bouterse's inner circle from within. And if the Americans could flip him after the coup in 1982, then it's entirely possible that Valk influenced him before. Because there's something else going on with Roy Horb, and it's something that made him particularly vulnerable to recruitment. Something that made intelligence services and Gladio operatives, they've exploited this for decades. See, Roy Horb was a gay or a bisexual man inside of a military culture that prided itself on traditional displays of masculinity. Now, his sexuality was an open secret in Surinamese military, and one that could destroy him professionally if it ever became public. Mike Winkel, an Antillian who worked with Dictator at the Surinamese National Information Service, told William Holtman that Horb used to use his rank to have sexual relations with the soldiers, leading Bouterse to make disparaging remarks about Horb's orientation. Now, Cuban ambassador Osvaldo Cardenas, himself a high-ranking intelligence officer, he stated that Horb had what they called back then mental problems, and he revealed that Henk Chinasen, the childhood doctor of Horb, had been treating him for his bisexuality. So, according to Henk Venox, a former SLM coordinator who testified in the December murder trials, Horb was lured into a honeypot in Pittsburgh while visiting Henk Chinasen and members of the American intelligence community. So, honeypot is just what it kind of sounds like, you know, when a bear or some animal goes to get honey out and they get stuck, they get their hands stuck. So the way that they got Horb stuck, allegedly, was they had compromising photos of him engaging in homosexual acts while he was in America, and those would be circulated as leverage against Horb after the December murders. So in an interview with President Desi Bouterse, he provides a potential clue about what he knew and maybe a source of who had leaked these photographs when he said, quote, "When Horb realized that we knew that he was abusing young soldiers, I think, that's my theory, he couldn't stomach it, as the great battalion commander he was, and that's why he hanged himself." Now, Bouterse's claim of suicide would be completely debunked by Marcel Nelom, as well as former police officer Herman Dorson, who testified under oath during the December murders trial that Horb had died by lethal injection administered by an army doctor. Sergeant Major Henk van Randwijk, he explicitly stated that Major Roy Horb did not hang himself, but was first injected by a medical student named Brewster, and then they staged it as a suicide. So while these details still remain classified, whether Henk Chinasen was the one who relayed his patient's sexual preferences to the Americans, that is unknown. But the pattern is pretty textbook. You identify where they're vulnerable, you create some compromise, you get leverage on the person. And Bob de Graaf, one of the Netherlands' most authoritative researchers on Dutch intelligence history, he confirmed that Horb worked with the INO, which is the Dutch Gladio network. So think about what that means. The man who initiated the 1980 coup, the one who had convinced Bouterse to join, who provided the original impetus for the whole operation, was compromised by both the American intelligence and worked with the Dutch Stay Behind Gladio network. This makes sense when you understand that America were always behind the Gladio networks. This is how Gladio recruitment worked in some cases across Europe. You would find vulnerability, sexual orientation, financial problems, criminal history, political ambition. You create the compromise. Then you secure the control, and then you deploy the asset. The Italians called it il ricatto, the blackmail, the leverage that turns a target into an operative. And Horb fit that profile perfectly. He was closeted in a homophobic military culture. He was ambitious, but he was blocked from advancement. He was desperate to prove himself. He was vulnerable for external validation from powerful figures who understood what he was going through, who promised protection, who made him feel important. And when he needed to recruit Bouterse, he had help. Not just encouragement, operational support from handlers who knew exactly how to cultivate assets through personal relationships. Horb's persistence with Bouterse wasn't just ideological conviction. It was the drive of somebody susceptible to external validation, to being told that he was important, that history was waiting for men willing to act. And Bouterse, he wasn't waiting for anything. At the time Horb was forming the plot, Desi Bouterse was a sergeant major working as a sports instructor, selling Surinamese Viagra, which they called Drakenblood or Dragon's Blood, and running a chicken farm somewhere between Zandere and Paramaribo. So he wasn't really that politically involved, not interested in revolutionary action. And Horb, he visited him constantly, trying to persuade him, pressuring him to join, and Bouterse kept refusing. According to Valk's next-door neighbor, André Hakmat, who would become the deputy prime minister after the coup, Bouterse was approached by multiple groups. Officers tried to recruit him. NCOs tried to recruit him. He turned them all down. Until Colonel Hans Valk made his case. Hakmat claims that it was Valk that eventually persuaded Bouterse to join, convincing him with a very simple argument. You are the only one capable of successfully leading this operation. So the whole father figure kind of relationship began there, not through years of cultivation, but a single recruiting pitch that told a sports instructor that he was destined to become a national commander. Once Bouterse agreed, well, the pieces kind of fell in place pretty quickly after that. Members of the Dutch military mission reportedly used their intimate knowledge of the Surinamese army to help Bouterse and Horb assemble a team that was functional, ensuring all the necessary military expertise was represented, logistics, communications, tactical planning, unit commanders who could bring in their men. So this wasn't just a random collection of angry sergeants, it was deliberately constructed for success. And after the coup succeeded, well, Valk did not advise from a distance. Despite being forbidden by Ambassador Wegelin to make contact, Valk and Bouterse secluded themselves in a small room at the barracks for days. It was a crash course in army leadership, transitioning Bouterse from a normal sports instructor into a national commander, teaching him how to structure a government, how to manage subordinates, how to project authority with confidence, the Valkian education, some would later call it. By the time Valk left in June of 1980, 3 months after the coup, Bouterse had been transformed. No longer the reluctant recruit Horb had tried to persuade, now the commander who would consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and rule Suriname for decades. The officers who had said no, Botsa, Staphorst, Cairo, Van Rey, understood the oath that they had sworn, the constitutional order that they had pledged to defend, meant something to them. The NCOs who said yes gained power, but they also gained dependency on a foreign officer who had made their success possible. And the Dutch military mission members who had helped to cultivate those relationships, they found themselves not just advising winners, but having created them. By the time that the coup succeeded, Valk's boys, de Jongen, were running Suriname. You had Bouterse, Horb, Fernandez, the working NCOs who had staged the coup. Not the generals in their fancy uniforms and the Paramaribo social club memberships, not the political appointees who had bought their commissions, but the sergeants and the lieutenants that ran the barracks. They trained the troops, they managed the daily operations of a military force. Valk had understood something that escaped most foreign advisors. In the Surinamese military, real power didn't reside in the organizational charts that said that they did. It resided in the NCOs who controlled the men. And now those NCOs were controlling the country.
The relationship, it deepened really quickly after February 25th. So while The Hague was scrambling to figure out what had happened, and while Ambassador Wegelin tried to maintain some diplomatic normalcy, Valk was at the barracks every day, not advising from a distance, but embedded in the regime's daily activity. Valk, after all, enjoyed an excellent relationship with Bouterse, Marsevain would later tell investigators. He had advised them on numerous matters, so why not on committing a coup? But it was more than just advice, it was formation. Former Suriname's Deputy Prime Minister André Hakmat described it even more directly. He said Valk was kind of a father figure to Desi. Not a trainer or a mentor or a role model, a source of legitimacy and of approval. And that relationship really mattered because when Bouterse and his fellow sergeants started seriously considering whether to move against the Haperen government, they weren't just calculating tactical feasibility. They were calculating whether the Dutch, whether their former colonial power, their current financial backer, the country that still effectively controlled all the military training and equipment, whether they would actually tolerate it. So Valk's presence and Valk's approval and Valk's friendship suggested that the answer was yes. By mid-June 1980, Colonel Valk was hosting a farewell party. The Saturday night had been more extensive celebration with the boys, the coup leaders, much drinking as witnesses would recall. It was a kind of party where professional boundaries don't just blur, they evaporate. So Sunday morning, Valk was still a little bit hazy from the hangover from the night before. And according to André Hakmat, the civilian minister who was sitting at the table at the time, Bouterse raised his stiff glass of whiskey at the official residence of the Dutch ambassador and said the quiet part out loud. "Colonel, I am going to reveal something that only you and I know. Without you, the coup would not have taken place. We will always be grateful to you for this." Other reports quote Bouterse added, "There will always be a place for you in the Suriname army." Not implied, not suggested, a direct statement in front of witnesses with Valk standing right there. And Valk didn't object, he didn't correct him. Instead, still uninhibited from the previous night's drinking, he openly admitted to advising the coup plotters. He recalled telling them, "I don't want to hear what your plans are, but remember, if you do something, do it without bloodshed." Valk capped off this profound admission of political interference by simply telling the soldiers, "Just stay together. Now I'm going to go take a leak." And he headed to the bathroom. So many years later, in 2015, President Desi Bouterse strictly denied that Colonel Valk had anything to do with the 1980 coup. During a long interview with the writer Sando Hira, Bouterse argued that the Netherlands often tries to take credit for the major historical events. He dismissed the idea of Dutch help as nothing more than delusions of superiority held by the former colonial rulers. Instead, Bouterse claimed that he was the one who wrote the plan for the coup all by himself. Now, this statement by Valk at the party is the smoking gun that the Prompt Commission would later try to explain away. They would interpret it, the term "without you," as Bouterse's misunderstanding Valk's warnings. They'd claimed that Valk was telling them not to do a coup, and Bouterse heard it backwards. But if you read the context, after a night of celebrating and much drinking, the boys, Valk still a little bit hazy, Bouterse raising a glass and a toast, not making a confused statement, it sure doesn't look like a misunderstanding. This was acknowledgement and gratitude and sending him off with some cheers, giving him credit where credit was due. The Greeks like to call it in vino veritas. In wine there is truth. Or if you prefer the Hebrew, in comes the wine, out comes the secret. Right? And Valk's response, admitting that he told them to do it without bloodshed, shows that he understood what Bouterse meant. Not, "you warned us not to do it," but "you told us how." So the drinking culture had really done its work. It had broken down the barriers. It had made this admission possible. The whiskey was the truth serum, and the truth had just spilled out. And there was more spillage that was still yet to come. Peter Meyer's June 16th, 1981 letter to his boss, Colonel Marsevain, captured it perfectly. Quote, "On May 18th, the Laura family came to our hotel And of course, we had to listen again to what a bad person you were, talking about Marcevain, and how pleasant and fun things were, meaning drinking and financial fun, when Colonel Valk was still the head of the mission. Drinking and financial, those two words explain a whole lot about the motivations of the men in the military mission. Lieutenant Nico Laura was the perfect example. One of the mission members, the Dutch officer assigned to train Suriname's forces. And by 1981, Meyer was writing, quote, "Nico doesn't even realize he won't last much longer if he doesn't change his lifestyle soon." So the lifestyle that Meyer was referring to was drinking, heavy drinking, from a guy, Peter, who would soon be discredited himself for being a sloppy drunk by his own superiors. The kind of drinking where, as Meyer documented, one evening he, Laura, had drunk so much that he spoke openly about the coup, saying that it had been completed at Clements with Valk's knowledge, and that they had left Clements. You know who they are, he said. So that claim, Laura's drunken revelation filtered through Meyer's handwritten letter to Marcevain, became more key evidence in the investigations that would follow. But the critics would dismiss it. They would call it secondhand information made while someone was drinking, documented by another man whose drinking would compromise his own reliability. But Valk's coaching wasn't limited to the sergeants he had already cultivated. According to testimony that emerged in 1983, as early as 1979, he'd gone shopping for a completely different kind of leader entirely. Remember, Colonel Valk had approached two officers, Lieutenant Roy Botza and Lieutenant Dick Staphorst, about taking action against the Aaron government. Botza later described the conversation, and Valk had pressed them. "When are you going to do something about this impossible situation? You're the one who can." And then, maybe a little bit more ominously, "If you don't do it, the non-commissioned officers will." Staphorst pushed back with a pointed question about Valk's loyalty to the crown. He's the son of the man who's the adjutant to the queen. "Was your officer's oath more valuable than mine? The officer's oath sworn under the banner in the presence of Ferrier?" And that apparently ended that conversation. Now, one caveat, Valk hadn't explicitly used the word Staatsgreep coup d'etat, but rather Macht overnehmen, meaning to take power. The distinction matters technically on paper. In the context, with a military colonel telling officers that the NCOs were ready to move if the officers wouldn't, the operational meaning was pretty clear. But what Valk wanted wasn't just any power grab. He wanted an officer's takeover. Men who were trained in the Netherlands, predictable, aligned with Dutch interests, manageable, because an officer's transition would have kept the basic structure, the architecture intact, replacing civilian politicians with military leadership while preserving the relationships that The Hague could work with. So the NCOs, they were the wild card. They were working class men with genuine grievances and radical instincts, and they were much harder to predict, much harder to control. Both Botza and Staphorst refused. Botza reported the approach to the defense minister Hoest, to two Dutch military intelligence officers, and to even Dutch politicians. The Dutch military intelligence saw Botza's report and decided it wasn't in the interest of the Netherlands to act on that. Yeah. So nothing happened. Either the reports never reached the decision makers, or the decision makers chose to not intervene. And in February 1980, exactly as Valk had predicted, the non-commissioned officers did it themselves. And that's where we'll leave it off for today. But here's the part I haven't told you yet. In part 2, we're going to go forensic on the 4 days before the coup. The intelligence that Valk withheld. The ambassadors whose departure route doesn't exactly match any conference that he claimed to attend. Two senior Dutch officers with identical alibis covering the exact same 4-hour window, both of them swearing that they were at home in bed when Paramaribo was burning. And we're going to find out why the armories were unlocked, why broken armored vehicles suddenly were repaired just in time, why the American aircraft were with a very specific code name were sitting and transmitting real-time updates to the Dutch embassies while the coup was still in progress. And we're going to meet the man who lived right next door to Hans Valk, the one who cut a hole between the fences between their yards so that they could talk without being seen. It all starts with a 17-minute joke, and by the end of it, you're going to understand exactly what that joke was about. I'm Matthew Smith. Thanks for being here. Go ahead and hit the like button and the share button. It really helps the algorithm. I want to thank you again for your patience. Also, make sure that you subscribe. I think that the algorithm may be kind of restricting some of the content to some audiences, so we need your help in sharing this and liking and leaving comments down below. And I look forward to seeing you next week.